All right, this is ninth lit, our last day of review for the exam. And we have a couple questions.
So I have a question about number 8 of the relationship of the
Did you have a question about the exam? Okay, so we got 2 questions. All right, so let's go to question number 8. You mind reading it?
the relationship of the church to the state and the you want to talk about like the actual
Okay.
history? Do you want to talk
I gotta, if you'll slow down just a minute, I need to find the question. It's number 8, right? All right, relationship church-state. All right, please ask your question again.
So I was just saying, if you want us to like say the history that actually happened, like history, you want us to talk about like what happened in the murder with the state.
Yes, you need to talk about the actual history that I gave you. The history that Henry was trying to conform the church and centralize the government and bring the church courts under the civil courts. He was trying to tax the church so he could fight his wars. That was his intention, and Thomas opposed that. And so you can also look and must look at the play itself to show you how that worked itself out and the reasons why they were doing it. Why did Henry want to centralize the church?
He wanted the power.
He wanted the power. Dictatorship's a lot simpler than democracy. We live in a messy system. It works, but it's messy. You don't get everybody doesn't get what they want. You have to vote and pass laws, and it takes time. If you're a dictator, you just say what you want, and it happens, and everybody's got to perform. So that's one of the things. He wants to be a dictator, Henry. He wants everything under his control. It's not easy if one person does it, but it's not. Somebody's going to get hurt that way. And then know why Thomas is trying to defend that or protect the church. Does that help?
Yeah.
Caroline.
It was the same question.
All right.
I was just looking for like more stuff to add to it.
Yeah, I don't know what you have, but that's kind of just the start of it. Yeah.
Wait, so we're only supposed to know the relationship between church and state and Murray Cathedral?
Basically, but you need to, because we didn't have time. We could have spent time, and maybe we'll do that afterwards, but we didn't have time to look at scripture, so we don't have anything but the play really to work with.
And then also, what's like an example, I think you said this like the other day, but what's an example of like temptation? Because you said that was going to be one of them.
Yeah, remember there are 4 temptations
Yeah.
in Murray Cathedral. There are 4 temptations, and you need to be able to find what is a temptation. You know what it is?
I don't like quick.
It like strays you from like what you're
Strays you from what what's right usually.
That's right. You want to do what's right, whatever that is. And temptations try to get you. They don't force you. They tempt you. It's a little different. They're trying to draw you away from it. Right. And so you need to be explained. What is it that what was the right thing for Thomas to do, and how did the temptations try to distract or prevent him from doing it? Yes.
What's an example of pride in Beowulf?
All right. Anybody? Yeah.
Was it when he was fighting the dragon, Beowulf like wanted to fight alone per se, or is it?
He wanted to fight alone. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah. And why does that have to do with pride?
Because he wanted all the credit.
Yeah, that's probably, he doesn't say it that way, but it's clear he's acting alone when he didn't need to. Other questions, other points? Yes.
What's a temptation in Song of Roland? Like what?
Really, the only place we see temptations is murder in Cathedral.
Okay,
So
so
you don't have to talk about, you would be talking about specifically Thomas's temptation. Yes.
What's the history in Beowulf?
One more time.
What's the history in Beowulf?
The history?
Yeah, like when you said the facts versus fiction.
Yeah. Well, the way I would approach that is that the history, there really was a Denmark, and there were Danes who were fighting Swedes, who were fighting Franks. So all of those, the context of the story is true. The details of the story are made up. So I don't know if there was a Wilthiel. I don't know if there was a Hrothgar. I'm going to assume that there weren't, just for the sake of our story. So the characters are made up, the events in the story are made up, but the setting of the time period is true. You see what I mean? You have all these real groups of people. I guess you could say, yeah.
For the facts versus fiction part, should we just focus on like Song of Romans and stuff? Since like
No, you can mention what we just said about Beowulf. There's certain things that are actual true about Beowulf. Most of it is not true. Murder Cathedral, a lot of it is true. Song of Roland, very little of it is true. But you can state what is true and what isn't. Yeah.
For the theme of pride and other books we read for the American people, do you want us to just to talk about like the temptation that the tempter came to Thomas with? What do you want us to
Under the topic of pride?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's primarily where the pride shows up. Is that
Because I didn't see really any pride.
that was it. To die so he could be famous, rather than to die because God called him. Yes, we'll go back to it.
When on the one, it's like the elements and characteristics and devices of epic poetry. Do you want us to, like, what does it mean by like elements? Like the elements?
Remember, I basically said that's the definition. Remember, we said that there are 5 things. It's a long narrative poem with an elevated, important character who does specific heroic deeds, who represents the values of a culture and their vast settings. Those are the 5 things.
And then you just want us to like talk about examples of those?
Yeah, you're not going to have time in 2 minutes to talk about everything we said about epic poetry. We said they sometimes use Medeus Ray. They often use the supernatural. There's often a what do you call it? The narrator's usually very objective. There's also the language is elevated. You know, so there are a number. There are probably 7 or 8 or 9 things you could talk about. You just don't have time. Did you have something like that?
Yeah, so when you're talking about like heroes, bravery, and chivalry, do you want us to just like explain them in the book?
That's the first thing you do, define it. And then secondly, yeah, find examples in the book. Like the example was, Beowulf, River Roland, when he was nominated by Ganelon to be in charge of the vanguard, he accepted it publicly because that was the chivalrous thing to do, with grace and enthusiasm. But then in private, he looked at Ganelon and he said some mean things to him. Yeah.
For the characteristics of good and bad kings, what are the characteristics? Like, is there like a list of them?
Well, the list comes out of this story. So look at Beowulf, look at Roland, look at Murder Cathedral. Which of those kings? There are 3 or 4 kings in those stories, and more actually in Beowulf. What are some good kings? Yeah.
Oh, good kings?
Yeah.
Beowulf.
Beowulf is probably a good king. Why do you think he's a good king?
Because he cares for like his people.
He's a leader.
Well, that's sort of the definition of a king for sure. But is he a good leader? What makes him a good leader?
He like wants to like help like his general what he's ruling, not just.
So he wants to protect his people. By that definition, what'd you say?
He cared more about the people than himself.
That's right. If that definition would work for a king, is Hrothgar a good king?
No.
Yes and no, but knowing that he didn't want to defend, he couldn't defend his people from Grendel. So that would make him a weak king.
So he's still good, but he's weak.
Remember before Grendel showed up, he was a really good defender of his people. For some reason, he was scared to death of Grendel and couldn't do anything about it. So that's just one characteristic. Are there other characteristics before we go to the next question? To make a good king, you have to protect your people and you have to care about them. But what else can you say? Generous.
You have to be generous.
We've talked a lot about kings that are generous are good kings. And we haven't mentioned Charlemagne. Is he a good king?
Yes.
By that definition, I don't know about being generous, but he certainly defends his people. What about Henry II?
No.
Less so, because he's trying to control his people. He's not so much interested in protecting them. He wants to control them. So, and then you go back to Beowulf. You can think of some bad kings, like the ungenerous Hiramod, and the dragon, who's kind of a king, represents kings. So that would be how you could approach that. Yeah.
For motivations of war, what do we need to talk about for that?
Okay, what are the reasons, say, in Beowulf or Song of Roland, what are the reasons countries go to war?
land.
Yeah, well, give me an example of land and treasure in any of those
Oh,
books.
that one where the marriage went wrong.
The Frisian slaughter.
Well, how's that about land and treasure?
Yeah, we're doing it for a tree.
Yeah, but what about land and treasure? Do you see any motivation by any king, by anybody in those stories to grab land and gain land? Yeah.
Sole reason Charlemagne is down there, right? Because he wants all the Spain.
What, he wants to kill other people more than he wants the land. I agree with you.
Oh, treasure.
Well, definitely treasure.
It's not really like a war, it's just fighting between Beowulf and the dragon.
Beowulf sort of symbolizes that. He's killing the dragon for the treasure, and of course, dragon is dangerous. But that would be one motivation of war is to. And what about glory? That's what Roland's motivation to fight war. He wants all the glory. Can you think of any other examples? And there should be others. Yeah.
Blood feuds was the reason for the Frisian slaughter. That's one of the reasons for war is feuds.
Very good. That's a very good answer. Not only anybody's ever mentioned that. A blood feud. Simply, you don't like these people. Revenge is another way to put that. Revenge isn't motive for war. That's why Friwaru is probably not going to get married to that guy, whatever his name is, who escapes me right now, because there'll be a blood feud. And Frisian slaughter is a great example. Are we done with that? Okay.
What role does God and like supernatural forces play in murder?
Great question, because it's easier to see that in Beowulf and in Roland. What about murder in cathedral? How is the supernatural or God apparent there?
Well, one of them is like will the supernatural be temptations?
Yeah. Remember I told you what Alex said? He pictured the temptations in that book. I never have done this.
Because temptations aren't really like a person.
Right. So
They're
he-
just more like something that, like, it's hard to explain what a really a temptation is because it's something more like that's in your brain that you think about than it's something that you look at and it's talking back to you.
Right, but remember all temptations have to come in this world, really, they all come from a person, even though it may be some,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's important to remember. That's why in the book, they are people, but he sees them as demons. And I think that's interesting, which is what you're saying. I think that's true, that demons you can't see. And demons do use things.
But would that count, like, as a supernatural?
Yes, if you explained it that.
Temptations?
Yeah, that would be, the temptations could be supernatural, and the church belongs to God. And that's what Thomas is defending the church. So he's fighting for God by defending the church. Yeah.
You could also say for that, they talked about how like God chooses a martyr, I guess. And
Very
so
good.
Thomas became a martyr.
Thank you. That is really good. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That whole business was about the choosing of God being the martyr. Very good. Any other questions? Any other problems? Yes.
Like, how would you describe a temptation?
How would me? I think what we all agreed on was that it's, you know the right thing to do, and it's whatever is keeping you or trying to divert you from that. And it certainly is something in you because you have a desire for something. We don't do anything. It's my belief that we don't do anything we don't want to do. Why did you come to school today? Because you wanted to?
No.
Why'd you come then?
Part of my
Well, because I
daily
needed
life.
to for the midterm.
What?
Wake up, go to
So you
school.
did want to come to
I'm
school?
old, right?
Didn't you see, it's my belief, and that everybody does what they want to do. Even though you say somebody's forcing you to do it, why do you give into it? You give into it because you don't want to get hurt. So you're doing it because it's for your best interest.
That is so crazy.
What is God's role?
If you can't do it, what's going to be
All right, before we leave that, okay, hold on to that. We're going back to Amanda's question. What is a temptation? It's those things that tempt us from because it's in us. We want to do it, but this is not as good as the thing we ought to do. And so the temptation, whatever it looks like, is drawing us away from the thing we ought to do. And I think there's definitely supernatural involved in that. And your question again?
What is the role of God in the Song of Roland?
Well, think about, that's where you see primarily what?
Isn't he like he protects Roland from being harmed, and he also, when like he's in battle, the only harm that is like caused to him is in like self-inflicted pain, and that's like through the horn, right?
Very good. He directly prevents Roland from, and if we read more of the book, he does that more. But every time you see an angel, every time you see a dream in Roland, those are also supernatural, which means they're from God. Yeah.
This is like going to something else, but in the Song of Roland, do you have an example of justice? Or is it Roland?
Yeah, that's, I mean, I don't think that's justice. I think they've overdone it. But that would be an example. They would consider that justice, the way they killed him and tried him and killed him. There are others too, yeah.
What are the weapons of war in Beowulf and Myrna's Cathedral?
Well, Myrna Cathedral, the weapons of war, and you can make the argument, are spiritual. You know, it's prayer, it's faith, which is in reality our weapons of war. But in, did you say Beowulf or Song of Roland?
Beowulf.
Well, remember what they wear. They wear armor, they use swords. He's given gifts of horses and swords and armor, and chainmail was a big deal in Beowulf. That was very helpful to protect soldiers. We don't use chainmail. We do use body armor. The Kevlar vests, isn't that what they can't stop everything, but they help, and neither could chainmail. But it's just a fancier version of the same thing.
Beowulf's armor, chainmail, and horses, and then Myrna Cathedral is prayer and faith.
Yeah, yeah.
So a question about the actual midterms themselves. I know what the oral is going to be. If I remember, we get 10 minutes
Yeah.
to write and then 2 minutes to perform.
That's right.
Oral, and then 2 minutes, and then for the written, what are we doing for that?
Remember, the next day you're coming in,
Yes.
and I'm going to take those 14 questions. You won't see them all. You'll only see one or two at most. But I've taken those and I've included some of them, and maybe I've merged some of them on the test, so that you'll have a series of short answers, 5 to 10 sentences, something like that, and then a bigger question, essay, which you have to have multi-paragraphs to answer one of those questions. That's what it is.
It's going to kind of give us like a small rubric of what we're supposed to do, and then we'll just write them down.
You're talking about now the written?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Were some of these like oral questions beyond the written?
That's where I'm getting my written test, is from
But
those
it's
oral.
going to be like split into like smaller questions, I'm guessing.
What?
They're going to be like smaller than
No, they might be longer. Remember, you're only going to write for 2 minutes, or speak for 2 minutes. You have an hour and a half almost to answer the questions for the written, so I could make them longer. Yes, Caroline.
So number 3 on the top of the board is strategy. I don't have a lot under that.
Which one are you talking about?
Strategies for war?
Yeah. The only thing we mentioned is one of the strategies that we saw in the book was the idea of the ambush that we saw in that story.
Is that Galen?
It was Ganlon and Marsilian came up with the idea to ambush the rear guard. We talked about the strategy of using, dividing your army into divisions or waves. You just get some insight into how battles are fought. I think that's useful. Those are the only two that came to mind in terms of that book. A lot of hand-to-hand stuff in Beowulf. We don't ever really see large armies fighting in Beowulf. So most of that, although we hear about it. And
Sword that they have much power, I guess.
yeah, and of course the weapons.
Especially
Yeah.
giant swords.
Yeah.
Video.
Excited to go outside.
I am
They
happy
finished
for them.
lunch.
All right. Any other questions? You have Alright, this is Monday, right? You are D, right?
Yes, sir. No,
We have
you're
12
D.
minutes left,
Well,
and so 12,
we have
11:30.
electives after this?
Oh, you have lunch?
Oh, yes.
I know, I get confused too. Yeah,
We're gonna get the work.
right here. Pilar's the only one that hasn't taken it. I hope she's gonna walk in that door in about 12 minutes. She's planning to take it. So just don't speak to her. You won't have the opportunity about the test.
We're getting them.
Yeah.
Maybe if I call her name.
Anything else? All right, so I would recommend that you find a partner. 10 minutes is 10 minutes. It's something. I would recommend that you talk with somebody about one of the topics, somebody time you. Please use your time wisely. I'll bring these things to you.